Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. Welcome to the show. As we sit here on Tuesday, Michael Cohen has completed his direct examination. He was poised, controlled, gripping at times, and right on the money as far as the prosecutor was concerned. The prosecutor set him up for success by leading with witnesses who had high credibility and with a slew of documents, invoices, emails, phone records. He then she let, who was the assistant prosecutor who was conducting the direct examination, then let Michael Cohen essentially follow the breadcrumbs that the previous witnesses and evidence had laid down. And so when he was testifying to these things, you can imagine the jury say, oh, yes, that's right. That's what we heard from Hope Hicks. Or, yes, that's what David Pecker said. So it was a very smart strategy. Some of us expected that Michael Cohen would be quite difficult, even on direct examination, and they would have to sort of hide him in the middle of the trial, start strong, end strong, and stick Michael Cohen somewhere in the middle. But as it turns out, he appears to be the last witness for the DA, and you can see why. He was candid. At times he was funny, but he was sober. He was serious. And at times he was looking right at the jury, and the jury was utterly absorbed. Now, he's not done. The cross-examination has begun. It's going to take all day Tuesday. And then when they come back on Thursday, it will likely take most, if not all of the day on Thursday. And he's going to have to maintain his equilibrium. He's going to have to remain calm. He's going to have to answer politely. He can't get rattled. He can't go off on a tangent. But if he does that, I think he may have sealed the deal. I think he may have wrapped up the testimony in such a way that the jury does get beyond a reasonable doubt. Listen, we know from multiple witnesses that Trump micromanaged his business, that he knew about the hush money deal, that he signed the checks, and that he wanted this taken care of before the election so that it wouldn't come out, adding an exclamation mark to the Access Hollywood tape that was so damaging. And why is that important? In order to get to a felony, the district attorney must show that the falsified records, dressing it up like a reimbursement for a retainer fee, he will have to show that that was in furtherance of a crime. The crime can be a tax crime, characterizing income that is not income and hiding what should be just an ordinary business expense, a payoff to Stormy Daniels. And it can be a campaign finance violation because he's using that money, which he never reported, in order to get himself elected. And that's what this whole thing has been about. And I think Michael Cohen, for all of his difficulties, for all of his lies, for all of his convictions, you kind of had the sense he was finally telling the truth. And he was so candid about both on direct and the cross that's already taken place that he was inside the Trump cult, as he put it. And then he learned the danger of being inside the Trump cult. No one should feel all that sympathetic towards him. After all, he did get himself into this position. He got paid handsomely to lie and do things that were not legal. But you also have to give him credit and that he's a pretty solid witness, at least so far. Now, things can go south, don't get me wrong. But right now, I think the prosecution must be feeling pretty good about their case. What's going on almost outside the courtroom, but really in the witness and in the gallery, rather, of the people, the audience who is observing, Trump is sending down a troop of mini-me's, members of Congress, including the Speaker of the House, dressed identically to Trump, blue suits, red ties. They look ridiculous. And they then come out and do what he's not allowed to do, which is to bash the judge and to bash other people. So it's a thinly disguised way to get around the judge's gag order. At some point, it may become so difficult to make a distinction between what Trump is saying and wants to be said and what these people are saying, that the DA decides to bring up the gag order once again to see if Trump is essentially violating it by using these people as mouthpieces. But that aside, just look at this spectacle of members of Congress who tout him as this great paragon of virtue, coming in to show support in a hush money case involving a payoff to a porn star that he had sex with when his wife had just delivered their baby. That's what they're supporting? That's the moral support they're giving him? And it just shows you the degree to which the Republican Party is nothing but a cult of personality. There is nothing related to the American people other than horror that would require a congressman's presence. There's nothing about this trial that is good for America. There's nothing about this trial that requires congressmen to consider the results. It's simply a ploy to get on his good side and to convince the American people that there's nothing wrong with this. The trial was rigged. There was no evidence, on and on. I don't think it's going to work. First of all, if the jury convicts, he's going to have a lot of trouble. And secondly, the reporting has been pretty accurate on this one. We don't have cameras in the courtroom. That's a shame because you can't get the full impact of the testimony. But Americans really are getting a upfront look at just how sleazy, how disreputable he is. And yeah, they knew that. And yeah, they voted for him once before. But they're really getting a load of it. And they're also getting a load of the people whose lives he upended, whether it's Michael Cohen or Hope Hicks or Stormy Daniels. And that's not a particularly appealing view. Remember, Donald Trump didn't want this coming out because, at least according to Michael Cohen, he knew it would hurt him with women voters. Well, it's coming out before this new election, so perhaps it will once again. Meanwhile, the campaign goes on. Biden continues to go around the country touting his infrastructure, touting his chips. He travels regularly. He vigorously makes the case for his accomplishments. And I must say, if you can for a moment blot out the polls, which I keep repeating, are not predictive of anything at this stage, there's really no comparison between these two campaigns. Biden is talking about policy. He has things he's accomplished that he can tell the American people about. He's not on criminal trial. He doesn't rant and rave. He is completely cognizant of the issues and the challenges that face the American people. And what is Trump doing? First of all, he has no campaign to speak of. He doesn't have offices. He doesn't have a turnout the vote operation. He has very few ads so far. He has these rallies in which he is batshit crazy. Excuse my language. He rants about Hannibal Lecter. Excuse me? He talks about eating hot dogs. He goes on one tangent after another, and at times he can't even spit out a word. That suggests his brain is not working properly. He is emotionally, mentally, and I think physically disabled at this point. And you only need listen to about a minute of this to realize the guy is crackers. And the problem is that the American people don't get a full flavor because the press doesn't show us a minute. They show us 5 seconds, or they take a clip of a clip and print that in the newspaper. They're not giving the American people a complete picture of Donald Trump's deteriorated brain. And that's malpractice for journalism. That's dangerous for democracy. And it's really indefensible. After months of talking about Biden's age, which they talk not at all about anymore, because, of course, he's vigorous, he's doing his job, he's campaigning, they're just going to ignore Donald Trump's obvious problems, his derangement, his utter lack of impulse control, his incoherence. I guess so. That's their idea of what balanced coverage is. It's not. It's not fair. It's not accurate. And if the American people don't wise up and look beyond the limited mainstream coverage, they're going to miss a very stark choice. An accomplished, good president, mentally, emotionally equipped, and someone who is mentally, emotionally out to lunch, dangerous, and really pretty much a sleazeball. So you can't say you weren't warned. You can't say you didn't have a choice. So there you have it. We have many international issues which pose national security threat to the United States. There's Russia that's on the march still. There is Iran that not so long ago bombarded Israel with hundreds of missiles. We have China, which is economically and militarily competing with the United States. And we have a domestic right-wing violent movement still that no longer believes in democracy. That's an extraordinary array of intelligence threats. And we should treat them, including the MAGA movement, as a security threat. After all, the January 6th committee identified right-wing militias and other violent groups as a threat to national security, one that requires law enforcement and intelligence to monitor and to be wise to. So what have we done? Where are we vulnerable? And what would it mean to reelect the man who presided over January 6th and who withheld this most closely held secrets of the United States, obstructed an investigation, and has been indicted for violating the Espionage Act? Well, we've got the perfect person. Tom Joscelyn was a well-known conservative foreign policy and intelligence maven for many years. He then went on as a staffer for the January 6th committee. And there's no one who had more input, I think, in that final report, which was so detailed, so newsworthy, so insightful than Tom. And that's who we have to join us today. So we are lucky to have him. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Jen. It's been a long, long time.
It is. We knew each other in a prior life when we were both hawkish Republicans who thought Russia was a threat to world security, that America's alliances mattered, and that free trade and robust immigration were important. A lifetime ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that if you went back in time that either one of us would have bet on the country or our politics evolving the way or devolving in the way that they have since
kidding.
then.
No kidding. So let's jump right in there. The January 6th report, which you spent, thousands of hours probably, and more before that in exploring witnesses and looking at testimony. Has anything that you've seen since that report come out changed any of the conclusions that you reached?
No. I mean, I think we've seen some new additional details come out of Jack Smith's investigation, special counsel. There have been a few little nuggets here and there. But overall, I mean, I think what's come out that's new is just entirely consistent with what we found on the committee. There's, for example, there were some new nuggets of information about the fake elector scheme and some memos that some of the participants and the chief architect of that scheme really hid from the committee that provided additional corroboration from what we thought, which was it was about obstructing the joint session of Congress and nothing else. But stuff like that and some other details about what happened in Detroit, but nothing that fundamentally changes the character of what we found.
Now, it's funny we should be talking at this point because Steve Bannon, who evaded the subpoena, actually he ignored it entirely, is marching off to prison. And Peter Navarro is already in prison. When you look back on those witnesses now, how helpful would it have been to have them, do you think? Was there information that you didn't have access to and that the American people still haven't had access to that you think is critical? Or do you think you kind of filled in the blanks with all the other testimony and witnesses that you had?
I think that, take Steve Bannon, for example. I think he's a very dangerous extremist. I think he's one of the more dangerous people in this story. I certainly would have liked to have explored his communications more and who he's in touch with and contact with. He was one of the few people who talked to President Trump on January 6th itself. One of the things the committee found was that Bannon text messaged his assistant, Alexandra Priet, I think her name is, text messaged her at one point after January 6th. The assistant says basically, I'm out. I don't want to have anything to do with this anymore. And he says, it's not over. What happens if, some large number of Trump supporters surrounds the Capitol and prevents the transfer of power on January 20th. And he adds peacefully, of course, after January 6th.
Right.
I mean, the bottom line is this is a guy who was hell bent on stopping Joe Biden from becoming the lawful president of the United States. And I think that entire movement is similarly still committed to this type of destruction of our democracy.
One nugget that you were not able to crack, and I don't think Jack Smith has been able to crack, is exactly what happened in the so-called war room. That was the war room in which a number of people, including we were led to believe at one point, the chief of staff visited, that were there as kind of a conduit between the inner circle of Trump henchmen and the people that were out there on the mall. What, if anything, do we know about what really happened? And do you think we're ever going to find out?
Well, I would point listeners to a couple of key sections of the report where I think that the evidence probably is more there than we know. So, for example, there's all sorts of ties between people who are key liaisons or advisors to Trump and right-wing extremists who attack the Capitol. There's a section, and we can't assume anything from that. I can't conclude that any of these people knew what was coming or knew exactly what was going on, but it's something certainly that I would have liked to investigate more, and I'm sure Jack Smith's team would have liked to have investigated more, time permitting. But you can look in Chapter 6, for example. There's a section on, Roger Stone, one of the longest serving political advisors to President Trump, and he's, disclaimed and disavowed all responsibility for January 6th and said he didn't know anything about it. But, it's curious that a guy like that was very tight with the leader of the Proud Boys who attacked the Capitol and very tight with the leaders of the Oath Keepers. And what I would say is that even if he really did not know what was coming or did not have any inclination of what was going to happen that day, I think we're in a very bad space politically when somebody who's that close to the President of the United States, on the one hand, is also, on the other hand, very close to these types of rabid right-wing extremists who would lead the attack on our Capitol. That's just not an acceptable situation to be in, as far as I'm concerned.
One of the things that struck me about the report and bothers me to this day, it wound up in an appendix, but it was really a description about how our domestic law enforcement utterly dropped the ball. That they had probably, in retrospect, more than enough information, and they simply were not prepared to defend the Capitol. And in fact, since then, we've learned that they've never really gotten a handle on these right-wing extremist groups. How much of a threat do you think it is? And what's your assessment of where they are now when we're, 6 months from an election? Would they be prepared this time?
That's a really tough question to answer because as a result of the January 6th attack, a lot of the right-wing extremist leaders have been, arrested, tried, and convicted or pleaded guilty. So an awful lot of talent has been taken off the street. It's very difficult to gauge, who the replacements may be or how capable the replacements may be. In terms of the prior intelligence attacking the Capitol, I always kind of marveled at the discussion of this because you don't really need any intelligence to tell you that there's something bad coming, right? I mean,
Yep.
you had the Donald.win, which was the central website of the personality cult for Donald Trump. I mean, his MAGA diehards were literally taking out the MAGA crayons and drawing how they were going to block off the Capitol and prevent members from Congress from escaping on, maps they were posting on the website. So, there was no. And, you had all sorts of discussions of occupying the Capitol, and pre-planning for violence that was sort of being done right there on social media channels, right there in the open. So to me, it should not have required any imagination to be able to see what was coming. Now, of course, and that's, I think, looking at what they had, that's certainly true before the fact and even more true after the fact. So, but in terms of where right-wing extremism is today, I mean, what I'm concerned about is that even the nonviolent aspects of this have been normalized.
Yeah.
A very key component of Donald Trump's political platform is conspiracism, is a rabid form of extremism that is, what you would expect to find on like InfoWars. And in fact, Trump welcomed Alex Jones and InfoWars into his political coalition in December 2015 when Trump went on there. And I draw a direct line from that moment, actually, to January 6th, because it's the same type of conspiracy mongering and evidence-free sort of thinking and beliefs that give you January 6th. And of course, Alex Jones and InfoWars were key in really riling up the crowd before January 6th and on that day. So, to me, that's the type of thing that worries me just as much, if not more so, than actual violence, right? Is that we now have conspiracism, and this form of extremism is very close to the mainstream of one of our political parties.
One of the issues that we were supposed to address was to kind of get our arms around right-wing groups, to figure out who they were, what they were up to. And during the times that the head of the FBI has come up to the Hill, he's essentially confessed, no, we really haven't gathered this information. No, we really don't have it. Do you think there is some institutional bias at the FBI and within our intelligence agencies to not take this seriously or to not investigate? Is this a reflex action, a civil liberties, fault line? Is it that they simply don't know how to do it? What do you think explains the reticence to really get as much information about these groups as we have about foreign terrorist organizations?
Well, I think Ray has testified, and I'm no defendant. I'm not going to, defend Ray or anybody in government at all on any of these issues. But I do think he's testified publicly that the FBI, I think it's true, has shifted a lot of its resources to domestic extremism, and that the number of cases probably outstrips even the number of foreign terrorist cases now. And they do run into civil liberties protections and certain things they have to worry about in terms of how far they can go in terms of, penetrating these groups and understanding what's going on. But, I think, to me, there's a more fundamental problem here, right? Is that this is not meant to be, government agencies shouldn't be in a position where you have one of the two main political parties is espousing these forms of extremism and is normalizing it. You shouldn't have one of the two main presidential candidates sitting down for dinner at Mar-a-Lago with a renowned white nationalist, a white supremacist who was also just outside the Capitol grounds just outside the Capitol on January 6th, instigating the crowd. This is a very unique situation to be in. This is not, the problem here is that now it's a matter of politics, and it's a matter of trying to hold the line for everybody who's concerned about American democracy. And quite frankly, there's no federal agency that can fix that for us. It's down to the people now to see if we're going to hold or not.
You did a wonderful job in a report for Just Security, which is an absolute essential spot for all things legal, all things national security.
I'm happy to be a senior fellow there now.
And you're a senior fellow there. Congratulations to both of you guys. Looking at the actual crimes of the people who have been convicted in the context that Donald Trump wants to pardon these people. He wants to literally open up the jails and let these people go. Give us a sense of kind of who these people are and what they did. These were not just people who march up to the Capitol and said, "Go Trump, go Trump." These were people who committed some pretty serious crimes. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, you hear now at his political rallies, Trump is now is not just apologizing for January 6th or making excuses for or just trying to blame others, although he does that, but he actually celebrates January 6th and lionizes the January 6th crowd, the defendants and convicts. And one of the things he does is he calls people who have been convicted or are being held pretrial hostages, which is a very curious word, right? That's a word that's used in the context of military, usually in the context of either military confrontations between two different sides or in the context of terrorism. And he's saying that the U.S. government is holding his people hostage. It's a very strong and horrific way of creepy and disturbing way of describing the whole situation. But that word hostages, it evolved because people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and others would call people who were held, defendants who were held for January 6 crimes in DC jail. Originally, they would call them political prisoners. And then Trump upped the ante and said, well, I'm going to call them hostages, make it an even stronger word. And Trump still lionizes these people as political prisoners, as martyrs for his cause, which is, again, creepy. So my thing was, okay, well, he specifically talks about, of course, he talks about pardoning all the January 6ers at different times, but he specifically hones in on these defendants who were in the DC jail, being held at DC jail. And at times he says, or he reportedly says to people involved in this movement, this January 6th movement, that he'd be willing to free them and that they're political prisoners, and he calls into their protests there outside the jail. So my thing is, who are these people? The press didn't really answer this question a lot of times. And in March, Trump did this, and he called these people political prisoners and advertised a prayer vigil for them on his Truth Social account. And at the time, there were 29 defendants, and many of whom had already been convicted or pleaded guilty, who were being held in DC. So they weren't pretrial detainees. Most of them their cases had already been adjudicated by the justice system. And the bottom line was that 27 of the 29 had attacked cops on January 6th. So when they were people who were there because they were, and some of them were involved in some of the worst fighting, the worst medieval combat, hand-to-hand combat of that day at the West Tunnel Terrace. And these are the people that Trump is saying are hostages or political prisoners and reportedly vowing to free. And I think it's very important for people to realize that he's not talking about sort of people who were just swept up in the moment, who wandered onto Capitol grounds and didn't know what they were doing. When he's lionizing these people, he's defending them and he's saying he would free them. He's often talking about people who attack cops, who came on January 6th to Washington, pre-planning for violence and followed through with their designs. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind.
We recently have had confirmation of something that the January 6th report found, which was Mike Pence really was in danger on that day. How close in terms of proximity, in terms of opportunity, was he to being overtaken by the mob?
The mob came awfully close to him at different times. He's just, at one point the Secret Service, shuttles him down to this parking garage where he's kept for much of the attack. But en route, they start that route, the mob is getting precariously close, dangerously close to where he is. And the most important part of that story to me is this, right? The reason Vice President Mike Pence was in danger, his life was put in danger, is because Donald Trump put a target on his back and said that Vice President Pence had the power to overturn the election results. And if he did, as Trump said he should do, that Trump would somehow magically win the election and stay in office, right? That's why Trump supporters ultimately targeted Mike Pence on January 6th, because it was the culmination of the January 6th plot. Everything else had failed, and Trump desperately is trying to pressure his own vice president to act on his behalf. And that's why a guy like Pence, who was otherwise obsequious to Trump, who was a sycophant for Trump for 4+ years, he just draws the line on this one thing and says, I'm not going to break my vow to the Constitution. I'm going to uphold my constitutional duty. And for that, Trump sends a mob down to the Capitol to intimidate him, right? And Trump is asked after the fact, aren't you worried about that? Don't you worry about what happened to him? Don't you think that was wrong? And he basically gives this answer where he says, no, it's common sense that, he shouldn't have certified the election. He did that in an interview with ABC's John Carl. So to me, this is like one of the most shocking things, Jen, right?
Yeah.
Just think about this. I know it's been talked about ad nauseum, but I don't think the shock of this is really sunk in. The president of the United States turned on his own vice president when his own vice president would not violate the Constitution on his behalf. and then sent a mob down to the Capitol to stalk him, to hunt him, because he wouldn't do the president's bidding. I mean, this is shocking stuff. And then, of course, Vice President Pence, to his credit, will not endorse Trump. He won't fall back in line. I think he's said some things that are meaningful and helpful in terms of understanding all this. But this is how ridiculous this whole political movement is, right? That it's so wrapped up in this personality cult for Donald Trump that even after he turns on his own vice president, basically a lot of his followers just sort of shrug their shoulders and like, well, so what? And that to me is just disheartening.
Yeah, disheartening would be one word for it. Horrifying would be.
Oh yeah, believe me, we can definitely do the online source for this one. We can go all day.
No kidding, no kidding. Just in a general sense, from what we saw on the outward face of the January 6th committee, it was remarkable. The hearings were actually informative. The people were doing their job on the committee. They were presenting evidence, not just grandstanding. What was that atmosphere like behind the scenes, where you had a couple Republicans and a bunch of Democrats? What was the working atmosphere, and how did that compare to other bipartisan committees that you've associated with yourself, over time?
Well, I mean, it's very intense, nerve-wracking situation, obviously, as you can imagine. I mean, you're trying to tell the story and put together the story to explain to the American people what happened. And there were a lot of people involved in that. I think, the primary storyteller for the overall plot was Liz Cheney, who convinced me to help join the committee and help her, write the report and do some other things, including preparing materials for the hearings. I helped with videos and some other stuff that went in the hearings. But there are a lot of people on the staff that helped out. A lot of people who were molding and shaping pieces of evidence. But at the bottom line, at the end of the day, in terms of putting this in terms of the story, I think Liz was the main storyteller. There's some others who did some great job of telling stories as well. But if you go back to the witnesses, a lot of the witnesses, their own stories kind of spoke for themselves, right? Most of the witnesses were Republicans who Donald Trump had turned against because they wouldn't do his bidding. Like Mike Pence, these are Republicans who wouldn't help Trump overturn the election results in Georgia, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, or, at the Department of Justice, or across the board, and this is the sign of this is the evidence. You don't need any more evidence in this. This is the number one sign of a sick political movement, right? Where the leader of the political movement turns against members of his own party because they won't help him violate the Constitution and overturn a democratically held election for the first time in our history. And to me, that really is the number one thing that came out of the hearings from my perspective as somebody who was an insider, who was both helping to prepare and also, to some degree, and also watching them as a consumer of this information. It's just there was Republican after Republican after Republican saying, I just wouldn't do what Donald Trump wanted me to do because that was illegal. And, to me, if you're a Republican who is trying to think about whether or not you're going to vote for Joe Biden or Donald Trump in November, to me, it's easy, right? I mean, there's only one candidate on the ballot who isn't openly threatening the Constitution of the United States. And I thought that was a big thing in conservatism, right? I thought that defending the Constitution was a big conservative principle.
One of the things we learned and got maybe a glimpse of, but not a complete picture, was the Secret Service. What concerns you about our Secret Service, either their performance that day or going forward? It's an organization that has had a lot of problems, and it's not just January 6th in terms of scandals, in terms of issues. What's at the root of it there? What's going on?
That's a whole other can of worms. I mean, there's a lot going on there. Like you said, there's a lot of scandals. I mean, part of what it is that, you saw that with certain personnel in the Secret Service, Trump looked for people who were loyal to him who weren't necessarily loyal to the Secret Service or to their mission. I don't think that speaks for a lot of Secret Service agents. I think there are a lot of Secret Service agents who are loyal to their mission, but he found some who weren't and were loyal to him, and he would elevate them. You could see that he was starting to my mind, he was starting to kind of cultivate almost a Praetorian Guard. He wants to find people who are loyal to him in all these different agencies across the U.S. government and make them the centerpiece of his administration. And the first time around, he failed because he didn't act swiftly enough to find people who would just do whatever he said to do, no matter what. I think a second time around, he would be probably a lot more efficient in that. And you can think about what a 2025 or a Project 2025 scenario would look like. It's basically sycophants in all these key positions who are just going to do whatever dear leader tells them to do.
One of the things that happened was that a lot of the emails, a lot of the messages among them between Secret Service were erased. They were disappeared. Do you have a theory on what happened? Was this sloppiness? Was this inadvertent? Was there a particular person you think that said, we got to trash this stuff?
I don't know. I mean, I think, when it comes to dealing with government agencies, you always, incompetence goes a long way to explaining most things. Where a lot of times when people read nefarious sort of conspiracy theories into something or some nefarious act, a lot of times incompetence gets you a long way of the way there. But I don't know. I don't know, exactly what transpired with a lot of that. I think I'm in general, I'm pro transparency. I have been throughout my whole career. So I think, a lot of those records should have been preserved and made available ultimately. And I think, for something like January 6th, we need to have as much information as possible about every day specifically between Election Day and January 6th and the immediate aftermath for accountability, for people to understand exactly what transpired here and how far this guy Trump is willing to go.
Now, stepping aside sort of from January 6th, we have another federal case that is now landlocked in Florida because a Trump appointee has decided that she's going to gum up the works. But people forget this is a pretty important case. And we're talking about the Espionage Act, which is used for when spies take things that they shouldn't. Sometimes they share them with other governments. Sometimes they take them home. Donald Trump took not just like a couple documents, but lots of documents that were apparently clearly marked as secret, clearly pertaining to our secrets, took them to Mar-a-Lago, repeatedly lied that he had them or insisted they were his, and we think we've gotten them back. What does the big picture tell you about how dangerous this is if he were to return? And more importantly, the message that it sends to would-be espionage breakers, espionage criminals, if he's not prosecuted, if he gets away with it, if he just walks?
Well, I think if you look at his defenses for this, it again speaks to the authoritarian nature of his political movement and what he's all about. My running joke is, anybody who doubts whether or not Donald Trump is an aspiring autocrat just hasn't been paying attention, because he puts the auto in autocrat. It's all about him, literally about one guy, as just ask Mike Pence. And so, when you look at his defense of this, it's basically, as president, he can do anything. He can take any kind of documents he wants. He can store them in the bathroom at Mar-a-Lago if he wants. He can do whatever. And if he just sort of waves his hand and thinks that they're declassified, that's good enough. They're then declassified and no longer super top secret. All that is and then when he's confronted with all this, this is, to me, is a big part of the story too, because it's a big difference between what happened with him and what happened with Joe Biden, right? Is that he's confronted with, he has all these documents, and instead of, dutifully turning them over and saying, I shouldn't have them, I'll cooperate, here they are. Because my guess is he's probably not even charged if he just actually cooperates and says, this is the stuff I accidentally took with me. He doubles down, right? And there's all this evidence that they hid the ball and tried to pretend like, they didn't have the documents. They tried to pretend like they weren't going to share them with authorities or turn them back over to authorities. And all that speaks to a guy who's totally reckless and wants to be completely unaccountable. But, the big thing for me, Jen, on that part of the story, this one case, is I'd really like to know, and it's not necessarily a big part of the legal case, but still I think it's an important part of the public case, is I'd really like to know what he was doing with them. Like, what was he trying to do with these documents? Is this a guy who is always interested in quid pro quos? What was he doing with these documents, and what was his intent behind using this information? Was it just because he's a an autocratic nut job who wants to hold on to this stuff because he thinks it's his, or does he have something else he's doing with it?
And that something else could be selling it. It could be using it for blackmail purposes. There could be 1,000 explanations, but we don't know. And we're unlikely to find out, particularly if there's no trial, which is an outrage from a legal standpoint. The system works in large part because people believe in it. People believe that they're supposed to handle documents in a certain way. And when I talk to people who used to serve in government, they say, I wouldn't even leave my desk when I had something like this. One former White House counsel said, I would read those documents standing up because that would keep my attention that this wasn't something normal, that I couldn't just put it down on my desk or walk out with it. That attitude, it seems to me, is seriously impaired when the commander-in-chief doesn't give a damn about all those and takes a fistful of documents and walks out of the door. How do you maintain a culture of protecting our secrecy when the top guy doesn't care and, in fact, seems to believe anything goes?
I think it's crucially important that people realize that the core of MAGA, the core of Trump's political movement, is a version of anti-government extremism. Jen, I've studied extremism my whole entire adult life and different stripes and strains of it. Anti-government extremism, this belief that the government is illegitimate and that it quite frankly deserves to be overthrown, is not something that is on the far reaches of MAGA world, right? There's so many things that have been said in that regard by MAGA ideologues, by people, by Trump, by others. Vilifying the entire government as the deep state. We kind of laugh and chuckle at that, and it's kind of absurd and stupid. And if you actually know how the government works, you know that it's not some sort of hyper effective deep state. Just look at the fact they can't get any of these trials held, for Trump. But that sort of reflexive attitude toward the government and toward our institutions is deeply ingrained within Trump's political movement and MAGA. And that's what he's really running on. That's a big part of what he's running on once again in 2024. It's not to be president of the United States and the head of the executive branch overseeing the government. It's really to dismantle the government and our institutions and make sure that either they serve him or they don't serve anybody at all. And I think that's a key part here that runs throughout all of this.
And we're really, the only place we've seen this before Trump really was they had these people out in the middle of the country who wouldn't recognize the IRS or wouldn't recognize the Bureau of Land Management. These are the people who won't pay taxes because the government has no right to pay taxes too. It's really far-flung stuff. Do you have a sense, obviously millions of people voted for Donald Trump, and do you have a sense of how far this goes? In other words, do you think tens of millions of people buy this? Or you think it's still a core of a few thousand, a few 100,000? What are we really talking about here?
Well, I think we're far beyond a few thousand and probably far beyond a few 100,000. But I don't think that, the way I look at it, the way I diagnose this again, I studied insurgencies my whole life, my whole adult life. And this to me, MAGA and Trump's the leader of a political insurgency. It's not always violent. Of course, it's mostly nonviolent, in fact, January 6th notwithstanding, in other instances. But he's the leader of a political insurgency that wanted to first capture his own side, which was the Republicans, and then take the fight to the other side, the Democrats, the left, and overthrow what they see as the establishment and institutions and the government. And if you look at his January 6th speech, by the way, it's laced with that type of rhetoric. It's laced with, he's targeting the few Republicans who are left, who won't bend the knee to him, who won't do anything. He's going after rhinos over and over again, goes after Pence. And he's trying to basically end any opposition to him on his own side as he takes the fight then to the Democrats and the left and ultimately the U.S. government and our institutions. That to me is very much what MAGA is all about. It's this political insurgency. And the million-dollar question is how much has that sort of MAGA insurgent mindset cannibalized what you and I would know as the old traditional Republican Party or traditional right? certainly I think there has been some cannibalization, unfortunately, probably a large degree of cannibalization, but there are still, I have to think, brand name Republicans, Republicans who will vote for the Republican brand as opposed to Trump and the MAGA worldview necessarily, who have not been affected by this. But it's an ongoing process. I mean, this is part of the ongoing fight, really. I mean, if you look at what's happened in Congress, for example, where any of the non-political insurgents, anybody who didn't bend the knee to Trump, who wasn't part of the MAGA movement, they're getting ostracized and pushed out. And you're left with just this party that is totally servile to Trump and his interests. That's the $1 million question: is how long is this going to go, and how much more of the party, is going to be cannibalized by this movement? And ultimately, there is no hope in my mind of the whole any part of the party being salvaged if he wins again in November. I mean, then it's over for good.
Just to put an exclamation point on your observation, we had a phalanx of congressmen, all dressed like Trump, including the Speaker of the House, go up to New York and sit in the audience to watch him and lend moral support to the guy who paid hush money to a porn star in order to conceal his misbehavior from the American people before the 2016 election. If you had told me any elected person in the country would do that a few years ago, I would have said, that's nuts. Who wants to be tainted by that? But now it's not only not tainted, it's required. Trump is demanding those people show up. So I wonder, if push comes to shove, whether anyone would stand up to him again. You had most Republicans who didn't want the election results overthrown. You had too many who did. But this next time around, would any of them? Would you have a resistance? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think there'd be any resistance this time around. I think this is part of why political insurgents have to capture their own side, so that there is no resistance to their radical agenda. And that's what's been going on here. I mean, when you talk about Speaker Johnson, not only does he go and bend the knee in New York and play the game and side with Trump during this hush money trial, this election hush money trial, I'll call it. This is a guy who is outwardly is a Christian believer, right? He wears his Christian faith in all other contexts on his sleeve. He dabbles in Christian nationalism, or even more than dabbles in Christian nationalism. I mean, he's a guy who believes things that are, hard right Christian beliefs in a lot of ways. And yet here he is standing in Manhattan, coming to the side of a guy who had an affair with a porn star while he was married, and then covered it up during an election so the voters wouldn't hear about it. That's the type of corruption of the movement and corruption of the party that you can't get around. This is something that should be fundamentally objectionable to Speaker Johnson's beliefs and what he's all about. And yet there he is, bending the knee time and time again.
Let me ask you the $64,000 question, which is how you beat or how you dismantle insurgency groups. We know how to do that more or less on the battlefield in foreign places. But what do you do about a domestic insurgency? How do you deactivate it?
Well, I think, look, I know I'm repeating myself, but this is a mostly nonviolent political insurgency. It is important to keep that in mind. So far. Now, there are in MAGA world, there's open talks about national divorce and splitting up the country. And so there's all sorts of hints and threats of further violence. You have Donald Trump has already refused once again to say he would respect a peaceful transfer of power if he loses, so it's already hanging over us, this threat. But it has to be finding people on the right who don't want to be politically aligned with the Abu Musab al-Zarqawis of the right. The bottom line, when it comes to Iraq, there were Iraqis who did not want to be in bed with the head choppers, and there've got to be Republicans, a good number of them, who don't want to be in league with the head choppers of the modern right. It's, one of the things that I'm dumbfounded by, Jen, is how much sort of the InfoWars mindset has become central to the political right. And, this is not something I say lightly. I think that for example, Alex Jones is the most influential ideologue in the MAGA right. If you look at either it be Donald Trump or any of the ideologues who served Donald Trump, they've all bent the knee to Alex Jones and worshiped the altar of his crazy. And there've got to be Republicans who do not want to be that, right? Who do not want to be an Alex Jones MAGA Republican. They want to be, something else. They want to stand up for business principles or freedom or, some other combination or matrix of ideas that was more traditionally a form of republicanism than, January 6th conspiracism and Sandy Hook conspiracy theories and deep state nonsense and all the other stuff that Donald Trump and his people were pushing. And that to me is where I don't know if we have enough time before now in the election. I think ultimately it's going to come down to the ballot box and they have to be defeated at the ballot box. That's a big part to defeating this insurgency. But there also has to be communication with people. Just say, don't you want to be part of Team Normal, or you don't really want to be part of Team Crazy, right?
And reading Liz Cheney's book, which I would commend to all the listeners, it's really, first of all, well written and also poignant in a lot of ways, as she keeps hoping that Republicans are going to do the right thing, and again they don't. That there certainly is a cadre of people who know this is wrong, who know this is bad stuff. But time and again, they revert to loyalty to Trump, loyalty to the party. I think Mitch McConnell is the quintessential example of this. He
disgraceful
knew better.
Performance. Total disgrace.
He knew better. Imagine if he had voted to impeach Trump. We would be done with him, by now. What do you do about those people? How can you, if it's possible, reach those people on some kind of patriotic level or personal level to tell them that they have a choice and they can take back their party from the head choppers?
I mean, just take McConnell, for example. I mean, how dumb do you have to be in terms of looking at what's going on with your political party? The head choppers, the political insurgents on the MAGA side, led by Trump, are out for you, Mitch McConnell, right? They are constantly gunning for you and your job and trying to stop you. And yet he couldn't muster the courage to do what was right after January 6th. That's just cowardice on a level that's hard to fathom. I mean, you hear people say, well, he was playing this game for these Georgia Senate seats. And well, how well did that go? That didn't go so well, did it? I mean, it's just, there's no tactical calculation here that says that this sort of, complete cowardice in the face of this movement is acceptable. And people there's a big part of why Trump has gotten as far as he has is because of people like Mitch McConnell. There weren't more Republicans like Liz Cheney who said enough. Right. And it was January 6th should have been, that's it, we're done here. You have the famous Lindsey Graham speech, right, where he gets up on the Senate floor, talk about another profile and disgrace, gets up on the Senate floor and says, all right, I'm done here. That's it. We've had a hell of a ride, but I'm out. Right. And it's like a few days later, he's on a plane down to Texas at the border with Trump, kissing Trump's feet once again. I mean, it's just, this is a big part of how, these types of political insurgents get so far, like Trump, right? Is because his own side won't stand up to him and he bullies his own side. And you have a lot of cowards like these people who just won't stand up to somebody that they should know at least is wrong. And going forward, I mean, there's going to have to be a new cadre of leadership if he's defeated once again.
And I think that's where I return to again and again. Unless they lose, and they lose badly, probably repeatedly, because they'll make excuses, they aren't going to go away because they think it's a success story. First of all, they don't admit that they lost last time. And secondly, they did have the White House, the Congress, for a couple years there, and the White House for 4 years. They think they're winning. I think the thing that keeps them going is this sense that they're winning, that they're strong, that they're not losers. Once they become losers, I think this loses its attraction. At least I would hope it would.
But let's talk about, let's talk about how insane that is, right? Because Donald Trump was the biggest loser since Herbert Hoover in 1932, right? During his first administration, he went from being president to losing the presidency as an incumbent. He lost Arizona and Georgia, both of which have been Republican states since the 1990s. He loses them. Biden flips back Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, these states that Trump had miraculously won in 2016 by the razor thinnest of margins. He shows weakness across the board. He doesn't get anywhere close to 50% of the national popular vote. He then loses the House. The Democrats take the House and the Senate. So he loses. This is a guy who is the biggest political loser there is in terms of winning and then losing in a long, long time, in decades in our nation's history. And for anybody to associate winning with that is just totally part of the broken reality in which MAGA world lives in. But they need to lose again decisively to have any hope for any kind of reformation on the right. I think losing is necessary, but not sufficient. It won't get the job done, but it's a necessary first step to try and see if there's going to be some kind of rationality, normalcy here that can replace this on the American right.
In our last few moments in this really fascinating conversation, talk a little bit about the role of right-wing media, not necessarily the Alex Joneses, but the Foxes, the OANs, the Breitbarts, and how they sustain this ecosystem of crazy. Talk to us a little bit about that and whether that can be penetrated or disabled in some fashion.
I would never call for government censorship or disabling it. I think that's too far. I do believe in the First Amendment. I think that we ultimately have to argue our way out of this somehow. But the right has absolutely built an echo chamber that is very pernicious and is almost impossible to penetrate. You go back to the 1990s with the rise of Rush Limbaugh. Rush Limbaugh's whole shtick was all about how the government and the media and everybody else is basically lying to the American people, and the media in particular. He would flog the media in particular every day. And some of his criticisms, quite frankly, you would nod your head to. You could say, okay, there's legitimate criticism there, and there's been legitimate criticisms by the American right of mainstream media for sure. You can definitely point to that, examples of that. However, what's happened is the American right has built its own media ecosystem that is got a horrendous track record now, right? I mean, which mainstream media organization had to pay $900 in a defamation suit to a technology company because they were spreading lies about it, right? I don't know of any mainstream media organizations did that, but Fox had to do that with Dominion. The way I look at this now is, all the griping from the right about the mainstream media, and this is all part of the persona, the grievance industry that is perpetuated by MAGA. Part of this is like they like to complain about the mainstream media all the time. Well, excuse me, what's the number one cable news channel? Who has the largest audiences on any given night? If you're going on cable Fox News every night or 3 nights a week, you are the media, baby. So, and they've built a large media empire on the right that does have a large number of listeners, and they have this whole archipelago of other sort of smaller satellite stations and programs. Talk radio is still big. They have a lot of thriving social media outlets, that are doing this type of stuff, YouTube channels and that kind of thing. And they perpetuate this echo chamber where they don't want any facts to come in from the outside to penetrate their precious little beliefs. This is something that is very strong today. It's a big dynamic. It's part of how you get January 6th, right? It's because people aren't listening to the facts and they're just listening to what's being peddled about an election. When if we took 2 seconds of common sense to say, hey, maybe Dominion's voting machines didn't switch any votes because they did hand recounts in Michigan and Georgia and places where they actually looked at the ballots with their own hands and said, no, there wasn't any machine switching, but that never got through, right? And in terms of the right-wing media ecosystem. And so, in the end, I'll just wrap it up this way, saying this, Jenny. The way I compare it is like, there's plenty of times the mainstream media and the main media institutions get things wrong and are biased. Sure. I mean, I just dabble in that sort of criticism myself, but at the end of the day, the mainstream media publications are like a power hitting first baseman who bats .330 and gets 40 home runs, and gets on base pretty often. And the right-wing media ecosystem is like a single A shortstop that bats 100 and can't get the ball out of the infield, And yet that single A shortstop is criticizing this power hitting first baseman in the major leagues every time he strikes out. It's like, well, who are you to criticize, the mainstream media? You got your batting average is terrible. And you're down there in the minor leagues and you can't get anything right. So, I mean, that to me is a lot of what's going on. And the one last point is there is a lot of conspiracism now that drives right-wing media. There's a lot more conspiracism drives right-wing media now more than ever. And that's the success of sort of the InfoWars mindset, which has really taken over a large part of MAGA.
And to carry your metaphor one step further, that A-level shortstop who's batting 100 thinks he's won the World Series, and everyone around him believes he's won the World Series. That's the world we're living in. Tom, exactly. It has been, I don't want to say a pleasure because this is like painful stuff, but it really has been a delight talking to you. If listeners want to find your stuff, where can they go?
Rating often these days is just security. And, I tend to just repost on Twitter, or now known as X. I do that begrudgingly. I can't stand social media, but I do that occasionally. So if you want to find me there. But, look, I don't want to leave everybody on a down note. This has been a downer conversation about the American right, what's happened with MAGA. But ultimately, when you look at America, there's plenty of hope out there, and there's plenty of good people out there. And just have to get through, hopefully, this next election, and brighter days will be ahead.
Absolutely. And there's more of us than there are of them still. So it's a matter of getting people to care, getting people to vote. Thank you again, Tom. And thank you for all the work you've done, not only on January 6th, but over the decades, and helping tell Americans the truth, which is ultimately our only savior. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Jen.
And that was Tom Joscelyn. It is sobering stuff, isn't it? And it should remind us, and I will have more to say in writing about this during the week in my Washington Post columns, that we need an all-hands-on-deck defense of our democracy. We need to have our intelligence agencies primed for foreign interference and for cyber and other attacks. We need our FBI and intelligence to be fully prepared for any violence and disruption that the MAGA movements may wreak on the rest of us. We have to protect polls. We have to make voting safe. And it's going to take all of these things, plus a keen eye for disinformation and better reporting than we had last time in order for us to get through this election. But if we do, I think in the long term, we're going to be fine. If we can finally defeat the MAGA forces, they may not accept the results of the election, but honest, reasonable people will. Then we can get on with the business of solving our real problems and challenges. And we will do so with a reinforced and more vigorous democracy. So, food for thought. Remember, if you like the show and you think your friends might like the show, please tell them about it. They can listen and follow on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever they get their podcasts. Bye-bye.